Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we're doing part 2 of our feed drop of the Genpei War from my other show, Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. As I mentioned in the previous episode, this show aims to launch in 2026, and this is a 3-part series narrating the different episodes and the different encounters of the Genpei War. When we last left off, the Taira and the Minamoto clans were facing off against each other across the river Uji. A misty dawn was breaking and the first battle of the Genpei War was about to begin. So, let's get into it. Hello and welcome to Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. Today we'll be continuing on our multi-part journey narrating the history of the Genpei War, which lasted from 1180 to 1185. We left the story off at the famous River Uji, where the Taira and Minamoto forces are staring each other down across a huge bridge. This episode will focus on the beginning of the war in earnest, the Battle of Uji in 1180, and then it will proceed through the Battle of Kurikara Pass in 1183, a turning point in the war. If you have not yet listened to part 1 of our series, please do so and come back to this one. Let's get into it. In the misty pre-dawn light, across the Uji River, the Taira vanguard and Mochihito and Yorimasa's forces face each other down. War cries are exchanged, and the first battle of Uji begins. The first phase of the battle was an archery battle, where both forces were shooting arrows at each other from across the river. The Minamoto forces were accompanied by warrior monks from Mii-dera. The warrior monks from Mii-dera in the Minamoto forces were said to be very skilled warriors and archers. We have previously seen very ineffectual Sohei contingents, as in the case of the Heiji Rebellion before the outbreak of the war, but the Sohei from Mii-dera seem to be far more effective at holding their own in battle than others from Hiezan. The tale of Heike singles out 3 particularly brave and skilled warrior monks. The first is Gochi-in no Tajima. From Burton Watson's translation of the tale of Heike, quote, "Drawing his great spear, Tajima strode forward alone over the bridge. Catching sight of him, the Taira forces shouted, 'Now, men, shoot him down.' Using their strongest bows and their most skilled archers, they aligned their arrowheads and sent volley after volley flying. One arrow no sooner sped on its way than another was fitted into place. But Tajima, wholly unperturbed, nimbly dodged the high-flying ones, leaped over the low ones, and with his spear struck down those that came straight at him, while friend and foe looked on in wonder. From that day on, he became known as Tajima, the Arrow Downer." Unquote. Enter here the first true badass of the Genpei War. He strides across this bridge, seemingly fearless, and he's knocking down arrows left and right, and he's dodging them, and he's striking fear in the hearts of his enemies. The next from among the Sohei to distinguish himself was Tsutsui no Jomyo Meishu. Again, from Watson's translation, quote, "Among the worker monks in the prince's party was Jomyo Meishu of Tsutsui. Grasping a lacquered, rattan-wrapped bow and his favorite long, plain-handle spear, he made his way over the bridge, calling out his name in a loud voice. 'You've heard of me from times past. Now have a look. Everyone in Mii-dera knows me, Jomyo Meishu of Tsutsui, worker monk, one fighter who's a match for 1,000. Anyone who thinks he's up to it, come forward, I'll take him on.' From his quiver of 24, he drew one arrow after another, fitting them to his bow and sending them winging. 20 men dropped dead at once, and 11 others suffered wounds, until only one arrow was left in the quiver. Then he tossed his bow aside with a clatter, undid his quiver, and threw that away too. Throwing off his fur boots, he scampered barefoot over the crossbeams of the bridge. Anyone else would have been too terrified for such a feat, but Jomyo Meishu made his way forward as blithely as though he were sauntering down one of the avenues of the capital. He used his spear to batter his enemies, mowing down 5 of them. When he struck at a 6th, his spear broke in the middle. Hurling it aside, he went on fighting with his sword, slashing in every direction at the crowd of attackers, employing the spider leg thrust, the spiraling stroke, the T-shape attack, the somersault, the water wheel. In no time, he had felled 8 men, but as he brought his sword down on the helmet of a 9th, it struck with such a force that the blade broke at the hilt, slipped away, and fell with a splash into the river. Left with nothing to wield but the dagger at his waist, he went right on with his frenzied assault." Unquote. As if it was possible to outdo the last guy, Jomyo Meishu from Tsutsui walks in here and, with 23 arrows, somehow kills 20, wounds 11, then strides across the partially destroyed crossbeams of the bridge, and takes his spear and mows down 5 people. And then, once his spear breaks, he mows down 8 people. And then, once his sword breaks, he continues like a tornado with just his dagger. It's incredible to think about these fighters fighting this hard and with this much zeal whenever they don't even have a cause that they're all settled on other than to just mess up the other guys. There's no real ideology going on between the Taira and Minamoto clans yet. This is simply just a show of alliance with the Minamoto clan and as well just an opportunity for the Sohei to make names for themselves in this battle. The final to distinguish himself was Ichirai. From Watson, quote, "Among the warrior monks was one named Ichirai, a man of great strength and agility who served the Reverend Master Keishu of the Joen cloister. He had followed Jomyo's lead and was battling away just behind him. He wanted to push past Jomyo, but the crossbeam was so narrow that he could not get by. Seizing the rear flap of Jomyo's helmet, he called out, 'By your leave, Jomyo,' and he vaulted deftly over Jomyo's shoulder. Then he went on battling." Unquote. Not only do we have these incredibly badass warrior monks fighting, but we also have these sort of gymnastics and acrobatics going on the partially destroyed bridge. Whenever an army or a contingent or a company crosses a bridge, it's very common for them to destroy the bridge partially afterwards in order to prevent people from following them up, especially in a case where they're being chased. And the Minamoto clan was being chased by the Taira clan here, and so they actually picked up parts of the bridge along the way as they were crossing it. So on the Taira side, it's actually just cross beams and just posts driven into the soil below the river. So this battle is happening in part just on these posts and cross beams where everybody is balancing over the river flowing below. These 3 warrior monks seem to be the most badass fighters to have ever lived. Under arrow fire, knocking arrows this way and that with a naginata, strolling across the bridge to the Taira forces, emptying all your arrows, then throwing away your bow and arrow only to break your sword and spear in the enemy, leapfrogging over your buddy's head to drop right into the thick of it and keep battling, and land on a crossbeam or on a post that is above the flowing river below. The ultimate fate of Tajima is unknown, and unfortunately, Ichirai dies in the fighting. According to the tale of Heike, Jomyo, however, escaped and managed to drag himself back to Byodo-in. For context, Byodo-in was constructed as a pleasure estate in 998 for Minamoto no Shigenobu. Then it was purchased by Fujiwara no Michinaga, and then made into a Buddhist temple by his son, Fujiwara no Yorimichi, in 1052. The Ho-o-do, or the Phoenix Hall, so named because of the top-down layout of the complex, houses a large statue of Amida Buddha overlooking a man-made pond. The purpose of this complex was to serve as a replica of Amida's Pure Land. For more on who Amida is and what a Pure Land is, be sure to check out episodes 22, 38, and 105 of my other show, Bright on Buddhism. In front of Byodo-in, Jomyo sat on the grass in the morning light and stripped off his battle gear. He counted 63 arrow marks in his helmet, 5 of which had actually punctured. Though he had been hit so much, he was not at all badly wounded. Potentially overcome by how lucky he was, he removed his war gear and put on a white monk's robe. He broke his bow in half to use as a staff, and he began chanting the Nenbutsu. Then he started walking off in the direction of Nara, to the southeast, down the river. He was never heard from again. This could have been a ride off into the sunset moment where we're hearing that he died and went to the Pure Land. But it's not uncommon for warriors to have retired from fighting in their older age and become full-time monks as a means of repenting for their sins of killing and making war. Either one could have happened in Tajima's case. At this stage in the battle, the Taira forces begin to see the need to ford the river if they want to close the deal. But it was deep and fast-flowing with spring rains, so it was very dangerous to try to ford it on foot or on horseback. The best crossing, the bridge, had been partially deconstructed. On the northeast end of the span, all that remained were beams and crossbeams, as I mentioned before. There were no boards to walk on. So, a Taira officer called that they ought to find a safe ford to the north or south. But Ashikaga no Matataro Tadatsuna, the commander of 300 samurai and the member of a branch family of the Fujiwara, decided against this, out of fear that Yorimasa and Mochihito would escape and make it to Nara. He elected to lead his forces across the river at the bridge, and was lauded in the tale for his courage. He started the custom of yelling his name and lineage as a war cry, and was said to have had the strength of 100 men, a voice that echoed over 10 li, or 5 kilometers, and teeth that were 3 centimeters, or 1 sun, long. Ashikaga and the main Taira force, commanded by Taira no Tomomori, Kiyomori's son, eventually make it across the river and crush the Minamoto forces. Yorimasa gets hit by an arrow and urges the prince to go on without him. Yorimasa's sons hold off the Taira forces, and while they do, Yorimasa composes a death poem and commits harakiri, which the tale notes to be very honorable and proper, setting the standard for generations to come. On the back of Yorimasa's fan, the poem read, quote, "Like a fossil tree from which we gather no fruits, sad has been my life, fated no fruit to produce." Unquote. Prince Mochihito is now on the run, the sun setting, the battle lost, and he's eventually caught by the Taira forces and he's killed. Byodo-in is taken over by the Taira forces as well, and they ride forth into Kyoto, the heads of their Minamoto enemies on display. The Minamoto insurrection is a complete failure, entirely too premature, and the best opposition candidate for the imperial throne has been killed. The Minamoto forces were shattered, their allies broken before they could even rally to participate in the fight, and the temples that staffed up the warrior monks were now in hot water with Taira no Kiyomori for their betrayal and their participation in the insurrection. Now that Yorimasa has died, Minamoto no Yoritomo re-enters the scene. If you remember, at the end of the Heiji Rebellion, Kiyomori exiled Minamoto no Yoshitomo's 3 sons to the Izu Peninsula in the south. One of these sons was Yoritomo, who, after the Minamoto loss at Uji, proclaimed himself as the head of the Minamoto clan, and made to break out of exile in Izu. He made for the famous Hakone Pass, just to the north of the Izu Peninsula and to the southeast of Mount Fuji. Here, with the help of the Hojo clan, into which he had married, Yoritomo made a petition to take up command of Minamoto forces and gain the support of all the combatants who had planned to answer Yorimasa's call before they got waylaid in their escape across the Uji River. However, after seeing how the insurrection had failed before, the nobles and the Sohei are very wary to support the cause again. On the one hand, the Minamoto had lost decisively at Uji, and on the other, Yoritomo was moving fast and likely too brashly. For these 2 reasons, many did not respond, or they responded negatively. This didn't stop him, however, and with his paltry force of 300 warriors, he assembled at Ishibashiyama in present-day Kanagawa Prefecture. Kiyomori sent out a man by the name of Oba Kagechika to stop him. Their forces clashed on September 14, 1180, around 3 months after the first Battle of Uji. On an actual, literal, dark and stormy night, Oba Kagechika attacked Yoritomo's camp with a force of 3,000 warriors. Yoritomo's 300 were almost completely annihilated, but Yoritomo himself escaped into the forest. After that embarrassing loss, he made his way east along the southern coast of Japan, first to Cape Manazaru, then around Tokyo Bay, and then to the south of present-day Chiba Prefecture and back. All along the way, he was trying to gather Minamoto loyalists to his cause the right way. He was taking his time, and he was trying not to move too brashly and too quickly like he had before. His goal was to gather these loyalists to his cause and have them together by the end of the year. He succeeded, and by the end of 1180, he had raised a new army, much larger than the forces that had lost at Uji. He arrived in the fishing town of Kamakura and decided that this would be his new headquarters. About a month after this army had been assembled and Kamakura had been declared their headquarters, Kiyomori sent a punitive army down from Kyoto to go and bring him to heel. After learning that this army was on the way, Yoritomo immediately sent his father-in-law, Hojo no Tokimasa, to go and try to convince the nearby Takeda and Nitta clans to join his cause. And they did. Then, Yoritomo joined his Kamakura forces with the assembled forces in Suruga province, just to the south and east of Mount Fuji. It should be noted that as the Taira forces arrived, they were not in good condition. Command of this army had been placed with Taira no Koremori, Kiyomori's inexperienced and incapable grandson, and so whether it was the long march, the foreign territory, or just general anxiety and bad luck, this army was absolutely not on their A-game. On the Fujigawa, or the Fuji River, the Taira and Minamoto forces assembled in the night. Then, historical accounts disagree on what exactly happened first. Some say that the Takeda forces attacked first. Some say that a flock of waterfowl launched themselves into the air. Either way, something made the Taira forces think that the Minamoto forces were about to clamp down on them and tear them up. In the middle of the night, they retreated, and the result was a full rout. Within 2 weeks, the entire Taira army was back in Kyoto. In the telling of the story, the Taira ran away, tails tucked between their legs, in sheer panic. However, this was likely not the case, and it was actually a pretty smart move to pull out like that. The Fuji River was a large, wide, flat riverbed in this area, making it very vulnerable, and ahead of them lie the mountains of Hakone, which were very hard to pass through. Thus, the battle, which really wasn't a battle of Fujigawa, concluded. Here, we should return to the situation between the Taira and the Sohei that got involved in the first battle of Uji. To get started, we should discuss the temples in brief. During the Heian period, there were 7 Buddhist temples which held a great deal of power in Japanese political, religious, and military affairs. They were called the Nanto Shichi Daiji, and, though the entries on the list of 7 changed over time due to fluctuations in power and influence, we can say pretty confidently that Kofukuji, Todaiji, and Horyuji spent most of the Heian period as one of these 7 powerful temples. These temples were special because they were built by imperial command and they were staffed by the imperial government by monks ordained on the imperial platform. They very frequently served the nobility, the imperial family itself, and were often temples to which nobles and rulers would retire to become monks. The others besides Kofukuji, Horyuji, and Todaiji were Daionji, Gangoji, Saidaiji, and Yakushiji. Kofukuji was patronized and staffed by figures related to or close to the Fujiwara clan, and so enjoyed very close relationships to the ruling elite. Kofukuji was the Fujiwara clan's temple. However, after having been alienated by the Taira as described in the last episode, they began to turn against Taira no Kiyomori and sought to participate in the Minamoto rebellion. So, in the 6 months after the first battle of Uji, while the Yoritomo issue was being addressed on the Kamakura front, the punishments began to be meted out by the Taira on the Sohei. First, it was suggested that the lands of Kofukuji and Miidera ought to be confiscated, but then stricter measures were encouraged by some courtiers who had personal grudges against the Fujiwara, or against the Sohei. It was agreed upon to send a messenger commanding the temples to summon up their ringleaders and turn them over to the imperial court or face consequences. The messenger was shaved and beaten and sent back by the Sohei. Still fearing the power of the Sohei, Kiyomori then sent a contingent of 500 samurai with instructions to not use violence at all, even if they were provoked. The Sohei then captured and beheaded 60 of the men and lined their heads up around a pond called Sarusawa Pond, outside of the gate of Kofukuji. At this, a full-scale invasion of Nara was ordered. Command over the deployment was given to Taira no Shigehira, a veteran of Uji and one of Kiyomori's less favored sons. The soldiers moved on to Nara, and 7,000 soldier monks defended the city and its temples. They actually held their own pretty well, and Kiyomori no Shigehira was forced to resort to fire, which was inevitably effective on a city that was built almost entirely out of wood. On an evening in the winter between 1180 and 1181, Kofukuji, Todaiji, and numerous other temples in Nara were burned down, their treasures and statues burned with them. The destruction was unimaginable. Many of the largest and oldest temples in the city were completely destroyed. 3,500 non-combatants and 1,000 Sohei were killed. A famous statue of the main Buddha of Shingon Buddhism, Mahavairochana, known in Japanese as Dainichi, was burned and destroyed. The whole city, temples and homes alike, had been reduced to ashes. Soon after the siege of Nara, before Yoritomo and his forces could be handled on the Kamakura front, and before the fallout of burning all these Buddhist temples could really make itself clear, the ailing Emperor Takakura and Taira no Kiyomori both passed away. It was the early months of 1181. Taira died from a severe fever. It was said that his fever was so high that anybody who came near him would be burned. Kiyomori's dying wish was for nothing but Yoritomo's head to be laid before his tomb. He named his successor as his second son, Taira no Munemori. He named his second son successor because his eldest son, Shigemori, had died in a tornado in Kyoto in 1179. Munemori set about consolidating the Taira forces. They were fighting on two fronts, and this was not a good thing. They had the Kamakura front, commanded by Kiyomori's grandson, Taira no Koremori, to very little success, where they were messing with Yoritomo, and then they had the Nara front, where the punitive army commanded by Taira no Tomomori was wreaking havoc on the Buddhist temples for the actions of the Sohei. Under Munemori, these forces needed to regroup and come up with next steps. They were on the front foot for the most part. In their minds, they had put down the threat of the Sohei by burning down Nara, and they also had retreated from the Battle of Fujigawa, so their losses were incredibly minimal. For the moment, they regrouped and consolidated their territories in and around Kyoto. Now, we mentioned previously that the nobles and the Sohei were very wary of throwing in with Minamoto after their crushing loss at the First Battle of Uji. This is exacerbated by the fact that Taira no Kiyomori sent that punitive army to burn down Nara before he died. None of the nobles and none of the neutral Sohei want to have a punitive army sent to them to burn down their temples or to burn down their towns. So, Yoritomo had a great deal of statesmanship and diplomacy to do to garner anybody's support. This is exactly what he spent his time doing along the coast of Kamakura, Tokyo Bay, and Chiba. His family, on the other hand, needed no convincing to come to his aid. Yoritomo's uncle, Yuki-ie, and his cousin, Yoshinaka, were doing nothing more than waiting out the winter so that they could come down from the mountains to the east and get started supporting the Minamoto forces and messing up the Taira's lives. Yoshinaka came down from the mountains once the weather had improved, and he took up residence in Echigo province, which corresponds to present-day Niigata prefecture. While there, he even successfully fought off a Taira force that had been sent to squash him. Meanwhile, Yoritomo's uncle, Minamoto no Yuki-ie, had conveyed Yorimasa's call to arms to all Minamoto leaders around the country, and then, when Yorimasa died, he allied forces with Yoritomo. In April of 1181, the ill-fated and more than a little brash Yuki-ie led a Minamoto force in a nighttime attack across the river Tsunomata in an attempt to surprise and massacre the Taira forces that were camped there. The Tsunomata River is in present-day Gifu Prefecture, which was right on the borderlands of territory controlled by the Minamoto to the east and the Taira, commanded by Taira no Tomomori, to the west. Hoping to make a foothold in Taira lands, Yuki-ie attacked. However, the Taira spotted them very early on, and they calmly let the Minamoto forces advance right onto their ground and then counterattacked. This resulted in a total rout for Yuki-ie, who retreated back east across the river to join up with the nearest Minamoto army, which happened to be that of Yoshinaka. This was the Battle of Tsunomatagawa in 1181, which was a resounding victory for the Taira clan. In the retreat, the Minamoto forces under Yuki-ie moved to Yahagigawa, or Yahagi River. And there, the Taira forces caught up to them, and another brief battle ensued, forcing Yuki-ie to retreat once more. His force was very lucky to get away from that fight, because the only reason the Taira allowed his retreat is that Tomomori got sick and couldn't command. The old guard of the Minamoto, particularly Yoshitomo, Yuki-ie, and Yorimasa, were chronically prone to attacking or making their moves entirely too prematurely. They all too frequently made their moves way too soon without securing any of their positions first. Meanwhile, the Taira were incredibly mobile and fast enough that they caught up to Yorimasa across the river Uji, fast enough that they retreated from the Fujigawa all the way back to Kyoto in just 12 days, and fast enough that they caught up to Yuki-ie at Yahagigawa. This knowledge of the failures of his predecessors, would weigh heavily on Yoritomo's decision-making in the coming years of the war. With this backdrop, In 1181, you could say that there were three power blocks in Japan: the Taira in Kyoto, the Minamoto no Yoritomo forces in Kamakura, and the Minamoto no Yoshinaka forces in Shinano, which corresponds to present-day Nagano, as well as in Echigo or Niigata. Keep these three blocks straight in your mind because they will be the biggest actors in the next episode. At this point in the story, in 1181 and 1182, a massive famine and epidemic kicked up in Japan, and the war simply ground to a halt for an entire year. This deadly combination absolutely decimated the population of the counties in and around Kyoto, and many believed it to be a punishment being inflicted on the Taira forces by the gods and Buddhas for their actions in Nara. There is unfortunately little data on this, but the disease was likely bubonic plague, smallpox, or malaria. However, we can't say for sure. This did not affect the Minamoto to the east nearly as much, and so they were able to continue to consolidate, shore up, and augment their forces and defenses. Thus, the span of this 1 year of plague and famine was not spent idly. Yoshinaka, having brought his sphere of influence to now include most of the northern and western provinces, was getting increasingly powerful, and it was making Yoritomo concerned. He had declared himself the Lord of Kamakura and the Lord of the Minamoto clan, and it was looking increasingly likely that Yoshinaka was actually going to try to do something that Yoritomo viewed as very stupid, such as declaring himself Lord of the Minamoto, or perhaps splitting off as an independent force, seeking to lay out the Taira and Yoritomo so that he could rule Japan himself. Yoshinaka was an incredible warrior, tactician, and fighter, and he was known for being young, brash, and proud. We've not talked much about it, but Yoshinaka actually forewent the name of Minamoto and styled himself as Kiso Yoshinaka, after the Kiso Mountains where he was born, indicating that he might have felt less loyal to the Minamoto clan and cause than Yoritomo would have liked. So to establish dominance, Yoritomo broke the epidemic armistice, not by moving on Taira forces, but by moving on Yoshinaka. The two sides faced each other down in Echigo, but Yoshinaka convinced Yoritomo to back down for the moment, not because he agreed to recognize Yoritomo's authority over the clan and over Kamakura, not because he agreed to combine forces with Yoritomo, but because the Taira were again knocking on Yoshinaka's door. Ostensibly, they felt that the Minamoto forces were split and that Yoshinaka's forces posed the most immediate threat. They were closer, they were larger, and, at least as far as the Taira thought, Yoshinaka was the far more skilled and dangerous commander. Yoshinaka's territories extended as far west as modern-day Fukui Prefecture, then known as Echizen Province. Theoretically, once Yoshinaka was pushed out of Fukui, the Taira forces could turn eastward and get after Yoritomo by way of the modern-day Mie and Aichi prefectures. So Yoritomo and his forces went back to Kamakura as the Taira invaded Echizen, Yoshinaka's western front. The Taira commander, Munemori, sought to raise 100,000 men to move on Yoshinaka's holdings. This was virtually impossible. For one thing, no army in Japan amounted to 100,000 men until the 16th century. For another thing, the morale, the health, and the supply infrastructure of the army was decimated by the famine and the plague. This army was in worse condition than when they had marched on the Fujigawa, only to then turn around and retreat at the sound of waterfowl. Nevertheless, using press gang methods to call up every single able-bodied man, they raised up this army, and it was put under the command of Taira no Koremori, the same Koremori from the Fujigawa incident. They set out in May of 1183 and were so badly organized and so poorly supplied that their supplies ran out when they were only 9 miles away from Kyoto, where they had departed from. Think about that. It's not that hard to move that far in 1 day. They used up all of their supplies in 1 day. For the rest of the campaign, the Taira army foraged, or rather I should say pillaged, the land as they went. Ravaged by famine and plague though it was, they still went on taking what they could where they could. Historian Stephen Turnbull suspects that as it went, the Taira army was, quote, deserting faster than it was marching, unquote. Meanwhile, while this army was stumbling out of the so-called home provinces around Kyoto, the Minamoto forces were digging in. They had fortified themselves at a mountain called Hiyuchi-yama, which translates to something like Firebreak Mountain. They had chosen a spot with rocky crags on all sides, dug a dam to make a moat, created stockades reinforced with earthenworks, and dug in, ready for the Taira forces. The Taira numbered around 40,000 by this point, and Minamoto's forces numbered 5,000, but these were 5,000 with a morale advantage, a terrain advantage, and an infrastructure advantage. In May of 1183, the front of the Taira forces met the Hiyuchi fortress. Thus began the siege of Hiyuchi. The tale of Heikei describes an episode where a Minamoto soldier betrayed them and instructed the Taira forces to shoot the dam and drain the moat. The siege and the ensuing battle lasted 3 days. From here, the Minamoto forces retreated to another stronghold at Ataka, and then the Taira forces followed and soon took that fortress as well. However, all the while, Yoshinaka was acquiring data about where the Taira were going, how many of them there were, and how they were getting there. He could see that there were only around 40,000 of them, not 100,000 as Munemori had intended. He could see that, in unfamiliar territory as they were skirting the mountainous interior, sticking to the coast, only to turn east across the neck of the Noto Peninsula in Etsu Province, modern-day Toyama Prefecture. From there, he knew that they intended to move into Echigo. In order to follow this route and to get to Echigo as was their goal, they would only be able to cross by way of one and only one fated mountain pass, the Pass of Kurikata. Now, I would like to briefly describe the geography of the Pass of Kurikata. In modern-day Ishikawa Prefecture, there is a roughly north-south strip of beach and about 5 miles of hinterland measuring west to east, with the Sea of Japan on the west side. Then, at the modern-day city of Tsubata, there are the northernmost hills of the Hida Highlands, a mountain range to the south of the whole area in modern-day Ishikawa, Toyama, and Gifu Prefecture. The pass is a narrow, little high valley spanning roughly 6 miles as the crow flies. On the east side, in modern-day Toyama Prefecture, the pass spits you out near the modern-day city of Oyabe. Once there, you can follow the coastal plains roughly east-northeast into the eastern provinces of the island of Honshu. This seemed the best bet for the Taira at the time, partially because they were in fairly unfamiliar territory, but also because to pass further south was to hit the Hida Mountains in modern-day Gifu. These would be extraordinarily hard to pass through. Additionally, they would come dangerously close to the Taira and Minamoto forces that were jockeying with each other for power along the south coast in modern-day Shizuoka Prefecture. So, Kurikata Pass was the best option for the Taira forces to move east into the heart of Minamoto territory. Minamoto no Yoshinaka found that the Taira forces were on their way in a force of about 40,000, considerably less than the intended 100,000, but still nothing to take lightly. The two forces began to take positions. Taira no Koremori split his forces into 2 parts. The south force was the larger of the two, and it was commanded by Koremori himself. Its objective was to take the Kurikata Pass and fight their way eastward. The northern force, which proceeded about 15 to 20 miles north onto the Noto Peninsula, was commanded by Michimori, a cousin of Koremori. This force's directive was to take a southeastward heading and enter the Etsu province, again modern-day Toyama, from the northwest. The Minamoto forces decided to make use of a trick to try and convince the Taira forces that they had actually been supported by some reinforcements or that their force was larger than it actually was. The Minamoto force dispatched to handle the smaller contingent of Taira forces would be Minamoto no Yuki-ie, Yoshinaka's uncle. Yoshinaka would handle the Kurikata forces further to the south, and, seeing that Koremori's forces were coming up the pass, he executed his trick. On Kurosaka Hill, a few kilometers away, he had his forces display a bunch of white banners, with the intention of making Koremori think that his forces were much larger. The intention of the trick was to keep the Taira forces on the pass in the environs of Tonami-yama so that he could implement the second part of his risky but very well-conceived plan. With the Taira forces on the top of the pass, Yoshinaka split his forces into 3 parts. One part was sent around the back to the west to engage the Taira rear forces. The second part dug in at the east end of the pass, opposite where the fighting was happening, with the intention of being an ambush party. This party was given loads of banners, far more than any single detachment needed to carry, with the intention of furthering the illusion of having a bigger force than was really present. The third force accompanied Yoshinaka himself to the south of the battle. The central party that rode with Yoshinaka raised a herd of oxen, and they lashed torches to their horns, and they waited for nightfall, while the west end force dragged out their engagement on purpose with the Taira rear forces. Their fight was slow and slogging, and was trying to be as strung out as possible so that it would last until it was dark outside. Once night fell, Yoshinaka sent his herd stampeding through the Taira flank, a strategy he learned by studying the ancient Qi general Tiandan. After the first shock of contact between the Taira forces and the oxen, Yoshinaka then charged down the north slope with his force, funneling the Taira down into the east end of the pass, where his other ambush force lay in waiting. The defeat was spectacular, and it was the first conclusive, major defeat the Taira had suffered so far in the entire war. Emboldened by the victory, Yoshinaka joined up with his uncle Yukiie, who was fresh off of handling the Noto Peninsula Taira forces under Michimori's command, and they together pursued the remaining Taira all the way back to Kyoto, with some minor skirmishes along the way, all of which ended in Minamoto victory. When word reached the capital that the Taira forces had been defeated so decisively, it threw everyone into a frenzied state of panic. They had no idea what they were going to do. There was the first victorious Minamoto army since 1160 bearing down on the capital, ready to continue their winning streak by fully uprooting the Taira in their own home territory. What will the Taira forces in the capital do? You'll have to find out in part 3 of our series on the Genpei War, where we'll be discussing from the aftermath of the Battle of Kurikara Pass all the way through the final battle of the Genpei War, the Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185. Thank you for listening to Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. I hope you've enjoyed. If you can't wait a week for our next episode, you can back us on Patreon at patreon.com/Nihonshi podcast. There, you'll get access to early episodes, bonus episodes, and a special shout out at the top of every episode. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. We hope you've enjoyed part 2 of our feed drop of Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast series on the Genpei War. Join us next week for the third and final part of this series. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.